Hi everyone, this is Jamie and welcome to another episode of the Yogi Within podcast. Let's just make sure everything's good. I've got a new setup here, so just bear with me a sec. Okay, so on today's episode, I'm sticking with the limbs of Ashtanga Yoga. And I'm going to talk today about Pratyahara, so we could class this as withdrawal of the senses, and Dharana, so this would be concentration. I'm going to group these together because I think that for today's podcast it's probably good to actually talk about these in unison with each other, because obviously they're very related. So we could say that we could describe this as taking our senses away from the external and taking those inward, and really the ability to focus and concentrate our mind. And I'm going to give my thoughts on this and why this is especially important, especially in today's modern world with things like smartphones and whatnot. I'm going to relate this to other aspects of the Ashtanga Yoga system, and also some observations I've had around my own practices and how these have changed, and why I think this, you could argue that this is potentially the most important aspect of yoga practice, the ability to focus and concentrate, and definitely to take our attention inward so that we're not so externally motivated. So a question I got asked was, why is this important? I think that in some ways this is quite obvious, and really the simple answer could be that so you have the ability to meditate, but really on a day-to-day practical level, it's so that we're able to control our mind. And we could say that this is one of the main focuses within yoga practice, and especially within Ashtanga Yoga, is the ability to, focus your mind, is to have some kind of control and order over the way you think and the way you respond to your thoughts and emotions. And I'm going to discuss this in a way that separates those two. And what I really observe these days, largely in people and students and people I come into contact with, is that everyone is in such a hurry these days. Everyone is in a rush, and there's definitely a culture, modern culture, that we should be doing a lot. I did a podcast recently a little bit about doing less, and this kind of moves away from a lot of yogic practices and traditions and Zen and Buddhism around, doing simple things, doing simple tasks, taking joy in, doing simple things and allowing the mind to focus on one thing at a time. And I would say that we are generally healthier and happier when we're doing this. Okay, so let's just start with why this is important. Why is it important to be able to focus our mind? Why is it important that we are not so stimulated externally and that we're able to take our focus inward? Let's just start with the way the mind works. And, this is something I've studied quite extensively over the last 10 to 15 years, especially in the last 5 years or so. But from a psychological perspective, but also from the perspective of how the different hemispheres of the brain work. And I'll go into more detail on that in this podcast from Ian McGilchrist's work on the hemispheres, which I think explains this fantastically. But the mind is a thinking machine. Its job, in a way, and I'm separating the mind from the rest of the body, and this is kind of reductionist in a way, and I don't mean it like that, but it's easier to talk about this, to separate it in some way. But the mind, it's a thinking machine. It's when it's doing what it wants, when we're not in control of our thoughts and our mind, it will continuously come up with new things. If we think about this in the sense of consciousness, or the way that our brain interacts with consciousness in some way, is that it's just in this constant looping process of producing things, thoughts, worries, anxieties, plans, fears. It will just continuously conjure up things for you to draw your attention to. And if this is left unchecked and in some way not tamed, this can lead to anxiety, stress, fear. It will bring up all manner of different things for you to think about or for you to draw your attention to. And half of meditation practice really, is not focusing on those things. The mind will produce a million things a day for you to potentially focus on. It will produce a catalogue of things for you to potentially focus your attention on. It's doing its job in essence, which is providing you things for you to focus on. Now, we are able to choose what we focus on. And I think that for some of us, especially before we start practicing yoga and mindfulness and meditation practices, it can feel like our thoughts are literally running away from us. This analogy of the monkey mind is that we're not in control of it. It's just doing its own thing. And, to just sit and be in a quiet room and be alone with our thoughts, for a lot of people, is terrifying and filled with anxiety and stressful, because we're not in control of our mind. And I think for people that aren't in control of their minds to some extent, this isn't a good place to be. It's not a good place to be just sat alone with your thoughts, which is why for a lot of practitioners, especially practitioners in the West, just sitting and meditating is a very difficult practice. You could say that in some way, this is an advanced practice. Having movement meditations such as yoga, Ashtanga yoga, or even other types of movement meditations with dance and things like that, this enables us to move the body and not just sit with our thoughts, but it also gives us a method to try to use a certain technique as a way to control the mind. And I think that physical yoga is excellent for Westerners, and especially for people who've potentially got stressful jobs and stressful lives, as a way to get out of their head and into their body. And when we get out of our head and into our body, we're less in our mind, we're less in our thoughts, we're less thinking, planning, stressing, memories from the past, anxieties in the future. The mind will just fixate on these things if left unchecked. So, using yoga as a tool and a method to, get out of our minds and into our bodies, so to be embodied, gives us some space, gives us some breathing room, so that we're not just sat in our thoughts all day and we're actually in our body. And it gives us some space. That's probably the best word. It gives us some space and some freedom, so that we're not in our mind and just thinking all the time. And it's a common thing to say from practitioners and teachers I've met in India, which is a common saying, which is too much thinking. Too much thinking is not good for anyone. Too much eating is not good for anyone. Too much sleeping, being lazy, all of these excess things in some way, and too much thinking. It would be good to think about this in some way as excessive. Lots of us will hear talks and podcasts potentially around, dieting and too much eating and things like this. But I don't really see many people talking about too much doing and too much thinking. This is almost potentially a disease in the West of overdoing these modalities. Way too much thinking and way too much doing. We live in a culture that glorifies doing more. We glorify these CEOs that are up at 4 a.m., 3 a.m., bragging about the 1,000,001 things they've done before breakfast, as if this is some kind of flex. That this is something to attain, and that potentially our lives are going to be better from doing this. I don't believe that to be true whatsoever. I think that the positive aspect to that potentially is not being lazy. I think not being lazy is a virtue and something to promote, but doing 1,000,001 things a day is not a flex. To me, this is just another example of the excessive monkey doing mind of the West, that the answer to most things in the West is to do more. It's to just excessively do more, and that is some kind of flex in some way. And really, to me, this is just goes against all of the teachings from Buddha around chasing. Yeah, the idea that we're always chasing something, and that we are going to be happy potentially when we attain that thing, and that's going to give us the thing we need. And most of us, I think, are very aware that that's not true. We have a very superficial period of feeling good about that thing that we've got, and then it's on to the next thing and the next thing, and there's this continuous chasing. There's not much peace and not much serenity in chasing things. Yeah, this is a kind of excessive need for stimulus. It's an excessive need to just want more. The goal is that more is going to give you more, and more is going to make you happy, and excess is going to make you happy, and by doing more and getting more, this is going to give you some kind of joy in life. And again, this has not been my experience. I don't believe that to be true. I think that it's just feeding the neurosis of doing and thinking, and that this stimulates aspects of the brain in some way that makes us think that this is the right thing to do, and that culturally we've been kind of taught that by doing and thinking more, that this is the correct thing. And I think that we don't really teach this to children. I think that we need space in our lives. Yeah, we need space to have freedom from our brain, freedom from our thoughts, so that we're not just thinking and planning all of the time, and that we're in this constant state of productivity. Yeah, I wasn't taught that as a child. I wasn't taught that we need to make space for ourselves. We need to make space for us to just be a human being, not necessarily chasing or looking for stimuli, but being content. Yeah, being content is a practice. Being able to practice being content. This is part of the yamas and niyamas in the 8 limbs of Ashtanga Yoga, that we can practice being content. We can practice being okay with what we have, and that we don't necessarily need anything more. There's a relaxation that is felt within the body when there's an acceptance of this, yeah? That we don't necessarily need to be distracted. Potentially we can be quite a slave to our senses in somewhat, yeah? Many ascetics and practitioners over the years in different yoga traditions were trying to overcome these being a slave to your senses, potentially, where, going beyond the needs of the body, we were able to kind of train the mind so that we weren't in such a need for so many things. And I think that there is some power to that. And again, this is mind control, yeah? When you have the ability to pause and not react and not be so desperate for some sort of bodily need or a bodily function, or some sort of anxiety to be met, some sort of thirst or some sort of craving to be met, you have much more control. This could be an excessive amount of that could be classed as an addiction to something, where we're not able to pause and sit back and reflect and take our time with how we engage with something, but it's just more of a ferocious need and something to be nourished, or that's the wrong word actually, but something to be grasped. It's something that is more coming from an anxious state. And I think that when we reduce our outward reactivity to something, we're able to go inward. Yeah, most of yogic traditions and practices are really around creating a strong mind. Yeah, and visually, when I think about this, I think about potentially like a weak tree, yeah, that doesn't have deep roots, and it's not strong. Yeah, so anytime there's a big gust of wind, or potentially a storm, that tree is quite easily uprooted and falls over, and it breaks. Yeah. A strong tree, a thick, deep, strong tree has deep roots that are very grounded in reality, in earth. Yeah, it's deep. And it doesn't matter how strong the wind is, it doesn't matter how bad that storm gets, it stays rooted and it's grounded. The leaves will, sway and fall around. Potentially even some small branches might break, but the bulk, the root of the tree, the trunk of the tree remains strong, and it doesn't fall over. And I think that an authentic yoga practice cultivates that in students, where you have this grounded sense within yourself. So however crazy life gets, however stressful things become, however much stimuli or, however much your senses are stimulated externally, and where we're overstimulated, you remain grounded and in the earth and in reality. And your yogic practice should cultivate that. It should be cultivating a sense of feeling deeply rooted and grounded in everyday life and in reality. This is what we're looking for in our yoga practice, so that we're not feeling lost. Not feeling grounded and lost is an awful feeling. It's anxious, it's stressful. We don't know which way the wind's blowing. We don't know where we're going, and we're not grounded in reality. So when I think about what the mind wants, the mind wants stimulus. The mind, it's almost like a small child who wants candy. It's like, if you keep giving the candy, the child's not going to say no. It's just going to chase it more and more and more, and it's going to want more and more and more. It's like there isn't any kind of self-control there. It's just, it's addictive, and it's addicted to it in that way. And I think that when we think about the mind, it kind of works like that. If you stimulate your mind in that way, and you look for stimuli, and you're chasing stimuli, the mind is not going to say no. It's going to keep chasing and keep doing. It's up to us to learn tools and techniques and ways to control the mind. The mind is, we don't want the mind to be in control. It won't be in control. It'll be let loose. It'll be running ragged and all over the place. We need to learn techniques so that we're able to control our mind, and we're able to control our thoughts. Now, I'll get into some other aspects of this around potentially the younger generation, but let's start with this actually. I would say that humans are obviously very different than all other species on this planet. And I think that we could say that modern society is improving in some ways. We could say that healthcare has improved in lots of different ways. But I would say that people are becoming more sick in other ways. And this is my observation of reality and what I see in day-to-day life. I think that people are becoming more sick in different ways. And I think that because we're so different from other species in that way, because we're so stimulated, because our mind is so much more engaged with our world, we've become much more sedentary in lots of ways. So much goal orientation and so much process-driven conformity and thinking and planning, that I think that people are becoming more sick in that way. And I think this isn't a statistical argument. More people suffer from depression, anxiety and suicide than there's ever been. And I think that, to me, this is a byproduct of the way the mind is being misused in some ways, I think, in the modern world. This is just my personal interpretation of this, and I share these thoughts and observations with Ian McGilchrist and his work on the hemispheres. So Ian McGilchrist is a modern day philosopher, I would say, but also worked in different institutions in England, studying people for maybe 3 or 4 decades who had physical and mental illnesses and strokes, brain diseases, all sorts of manner of different sort of ailments that affect the brain. And his work on this really has helped me understand really my own yoga practice, but also what I see people struggling with the most. And there's lots of things nowadays around eating well and exercising properly, and taking care of the physical body in some way, but we're not really providing too many platforms on how much we're overstimulated and how much exhaustion people have from information. And I think that there is a craving that the mind has. The mind has a craving for more information, and we're kind of taught in a way that by having more information and having more things going on in our mind, that this is progressive in some way, that we're becoming more intelligent. And I don't believe that to be true. And actually, this is also statistically proven that people aren't becoming more intelligent. People are actually becoming a little bit more stupid over the last 10 to 20 years. And I think that there's a very big difference between having lots of information at hand and being intelligent, being critical, and being able to think and argue 2 points from 2 different views and coming up with a reasonable and rational view on something. And I think that the way people's brains are working is definitely changing. I talked about this with Ian Greisack a little bit on some previous episodes on McGill-Christ's work and how the hemispheres work. And I think that this is a really important thing to understand in relation to Dharana and Pratyahara, is that if unchecked, if the mind is allowed to be unruly, it leads to this hemispheric imbalance of the brain. Ian McGill-Christ's famous book is called The Master and His Emissary, and the reason he called it this is because the hemispheres of the brain are very different, and they should be viewed in a very different way. And I think that with the correct practices, and I believe yogic practices to be very good with this, the brain is trained in a way that sees reality in a more realistic way. Realistic in the sense of seeing the interconnectedness of things, seeing the bigger picture, seeing things in a more emotionally balanced way, and seeing things, I would say, more grounded in reality. The mind can be left unchecked, is completely delusional. If we think about, I talked about this a lot on different episodes, but if the mind is unchecked and practices aren't encouraged to keep ourselves grounded in reality, the mind will create all sorts of fantasies and stories to protect itself from the truth and potentially some sort of ego fracture or something changing that affects us in a negative way, where we're afraid to feel uncomfortable or we're afraid to deal with reality in some way, and the mind will just create story after story and fantasy after fantasy to protect itself. An extreme example of this would be from McGill-Christ's work, where someone who's had a hemispheric stroke, so the right hemisphere potentially having a stroke, so they're not able to use the right side of their brain, which is largely linked to what I'm talking about around seeing a bigger picture, the interconnectedness of things, seeing things in a more humanic way and less robotic, less kind of removed from reality in that way. When that side of the brain has a dysfunction, people become extremely delusional. You could say an extreme case of this would be schizophrenia, where people are really detached from reality and life becomes very scary. Life becomes this mess where we can't depict things from being real or unreal. An extreme example of this would be that someone with this hemispheric defect could actually have lost a limb. There's examples of this in his writings where a patient had lost their right arm, so they're connected to their left hemisphere. The hemispheres connect to different sides of the body, but they would argue with you to completely talking to you straight dead in the eye that their arm is there and that you're the one that's wrong. Yeah. So this person will believe that their arm still exists because they're completely delusional. They're not able to see things in a realistic way. And even if you were to show a picture to this person that their arm wasn't there, they would still continue to argue with you and tell you that there's something wrong with your camera, or that you're trying to lie to them and give them a fake picture. It's you would class this as insane. You know? You would say that someone who was unable to use the right hemisphere of their brain could be in some way slightly insane or delusional to the point where they're unable to see things in a realistic way. And I believe this is becoming more apparent in modern day life, yeah, in the sense that there's a massive imbalance with how the brain is working. Yeah, there's a reason there's two hemispheres of the brain. They're separate in some way, and they're divided. Yeah, in the sense that information is processed between both sides, but mostly information is being blocked in some ways. So the main central column between the two brains, its main job is to actually stop information bypassing between the two hemispheres. And the reason it does this is so that we're able to see things more clearly. Yeah. The left hemisphere is very focused. It's very good at focusing on things and dialing on things, and it's very good at reducing things and, you know, taking things apart and seeing things in a simplistic way, but it's not very good at seeing things in a bigger way, in a more interconnected way, which is why if someone was to suffer a hemispheric stroke, for example, to their right hemisphere, they tend to struggle with reality much more, yeah, because they're unable to see things in an interconnected way. His book, The Master and the Emissary, is called this because what we really want, we're looking for the right hemisphere to be the master. Yeah, the what we want to be in control is the part of our brain that sees the interconnectedness of things, the bigger picture. This side of your brain is reasonable. This side of your brain understands things in a complex way. It understands nuances. It doesn't see things black and white. Yeah. When this side of the brain is more in charge, things are more reasonable, things are clearer, things are more stable, and you could say that things are grounded more in reality. With this flipped, and it's the other way around, things start to get scary. And again, an extreme example of that is someone who's schizophrenic, someone who's unable to decipher the difference between real and not real. Yeah. Someone that sees things completely black and white. There are no nuances. There are no differences of opinion. There's no grey area. It's just black and white. You're right, you're wrong. And they're unable to see things in reality. Even if you were to show them proof, even if you were to provide video evidence of something occurring, they would still deny reality because it goes against their worldview, because their brain is out of balance. This is a physical thing, yeah? This is a physical thing to understand, and this is proven and studied specifically with people with brain injuries. My theory, and Ian McGilchrist's theory, and this is based on my experience of life, is that this is becoming more common. Yeah, I believe that people's brains are becoming more out of balance. Yeah, I talk about Bandha a lot on this podcast for this reason. Yeah, is that if you're unable to see things in a balanced and nuanced way, if you're unable to provide an argument from both sides and come up with some kind of middle ground, this is some sort of sign of some imbalance. Yeah, yoga, meditative practices that enable you to kind of focus your concentration, withdraw your senses, less from the external world and more from the internal world, I believe help promote this hemispheric balance. This is why I feel like this is an important topic to talk about. It's also why I had Ian Greisack on this podcast, because we both share this view on this, that this is becoming, I would say, more prevalent. And I think that this is probably largely to do with the fact that so much time is spent on screens, So much time is spent in the fantasy world of the internet, the fantasy world of social media, where reality is not so important. Yeah? Whether something is real or not, or whether it's true, is less important in our modern day life. I've never lived any period of my life where I felt that this was more so than ever in my life, where reality and truth is not so important anymore. Yeah, it's why I talk about it a lot on this podcast. I believe this is probably one of the most important subjects I've ever done, really, on this topic, is the importance of truth, the importance of finding the truth, the importance of something being grounded in reality. If you don't have that, again, an extreme example of that is someone who's schizophrenic, someone who is unable to decipher the difference between real and unreal. This is madness. Yeah, this is madness. This is madness when something can't be agreed upon that's true or not. Yeah, and I believe that this change and imbalance in the brains comes from our practices. Yeah, like, what do we practice? Do we practice finding the truth? Do we practice trying to find what's real and what's grounded in reality? Or are we feeding delusional thoughts to ourselves to make ourselves feel better because we want to feel comfortable? This has got nothing to do with yoga practice. This is kind of a broad topic, and I think, like I say, this is an important topic, as I've talked about with McGilchrist, but Ian McGilchrist doesn't tend to offer many solutions to this, because I think that his idea is that people find their own solutions and find their own way. But I do believe that yoga practices, when they're practiced in the right way, are geared towards this. Yeah, Buddhist teachings and yogic teachings are completely grounded in the pursuit of truth and reality, and why it's an important thing for us to focus on. And I think that if you look at this from a biological perspective, is that, like most things in the body, we're looking for things to be in balance. Yeah. Again, you can find balance with your diet and your exercise and your strength and work and your stretching, but are you balancing your brain correctly? Yeah. Are you practicing certain aspects of yogic traditions where you're practicing finding a balance between the hemispheres of your brain, so that the pursuit of truth and the pursuit of finding the truth and being grounded in reality is what you're practicing? Yeah. Again, if this is left unchecked, we're feeding delusion and fantasy, which is almost like overeating. Yeah, you would say that if someone was overeating food, that this would be a bad thing for their body. Yeah, you would say that if someone was excessively drinking alcohol, this would be bad for their liver and it would be bad for their body. If someone was excessively feeding their brain with delusional thoughts and lies, you would say that this was bad for their brain. Yeah, I think that this is a clear thing to understand. Yeah, the internet, social media, and obviously with the recent event of things like AI, is expanding this. It's expanding the normalization of delusional thoughts and basically lying. Yeah, AI, in some to some extent, is fantasy and lies. And it's cool to play with fantasies and stories, but it's not coming from your imagination and your intuition. It's coming from corporations and people trying to sell you things. Yeah, the intention with these things is completely different. But you're creating a fantasy world, yeah? Lots of us are spending large amounts of time in some kind of fantasy world, yeah? Being on the internet a lot, looking at stories and fictitious information and fictitious videos is, I would say, is in some way the same as like overeating. Yeah, if you're excessively taking something bad into the body, it's going to have a negative effect on the way the body works. Again, the example of excessively overeating processed food, for example, again, it's not organic, it's not real. Yeah, you're taking in some sort of food that's been artificially transformed. Yeah. Same way if you were excessively taking alcohol, these are going to have a negative effect. If you're excessively taking in fantasy, delusional lies, this is going to have a negative effect on your brain. And I believe that this is what's happening, where this is becoming normalized. And I think that if not checked and left unchecked, this produces what I think we're seeing, which is people having more depression, more anxiety, and potentially suicide and things like this, where we're feeding our brain the wrong things. Yeah, we want to feed our brain the truth. We want to feed our brain non-delusional things that are grounded in reality. When you go outside and you look in nature and you look at things around you, this is real, this is reality, this is the consequences of actions that we take on in our real world. The internet, social media, AI, these other things that we're spending long times in are fantasy, yeah? And there's room for fantasy, there's room for that, but again, it's how much of that is becoming our normal world, how much of that is becoming normalized. And I think that if you think about this from a health perspective, what's healthy is true things. Listening to true statements, someone telling you the truth, someone telling you something that's not fantasy is healthy. That's a healthy thing to listen to. Yeah? Stories, we have time for stories, mythologies, because the intention is a certain way. But I think that, again, it's about balance, and we have to find the right balance. Otherwise, I believe the hemispheres of the brain change. And what was the master and what is the emissary starts to switch. And really that's the core teachings of McGill Christ's work, is that when that becomes imbalanced, people start to really suffer psychologically, to the point where potentially someone becomes schizophrenic. I would argue that in some way people are becoming in a mild way schizophrenic, in the sense of not being able to tell the difference between delusion, fantasy and reality. This is something I tend to come across quite often, where people are becoming so black and white with the way they think. There's not much nuances, there's not much interpretation for a middle ground. It's very right, wrong, black, white, and an inability to see things in a truthful way. And I think that I'm not taking like a high horse on this. It's just something that I observe and I practice, and I think that this is a very important thing to focus on, especially as parents. Yeah, when we think about the things that our kids are learning, and the younger generation is starting to focus on, we need a really strong grounding in what is real and not what is fictitiously taught on the internet, where fantasy just becomes normalized. Yeah. Just staying with that, actually, a friend of mine, we talked about this recently, and he said to me that the younger generation are really, clued up, and they know a lot, Jay. And he said the younger generation know a lot more than we did at our age, like when we were that young. And I said, yeah, I agree with that. I think that the younger generation are more informed in some ways in terms of information. And the argument that he was making was that it's a good thing to listen to young people because they know more. And I disagreed with this, because never ever in existence has it been wise to listen to and make big decisions in your life and society based on what young people think. And that's not to say that young people don't have a basis for making an argument for something, but they don't really have a lot of wisdom. Yeah. Dharana, Pratyahara, these are practices to cultivate intuition and wisdom. Information from technology is a completely different thing in my book. You can know a lot of things. Yeah, young people have access to more information than ever. They can quickly find anything on the internet and think that you're informed. You have a lot of information. So by having access to information and knowing how to use it more than older people, that this is in some way giving you some authority to talk about something. And I don't believe that to be true. And I think this is why what I've noticed over the years recently is that younger people tend to look down a little bit on the older generation as if they're not very clever, because they're not so tech savvy. They don't really understand technology so much. And that, because younger people understand technology more, that this makes them smarter in some way. And I don't believe that to be true. Being intelligent and wise comes from being around a long time. It comes from experience. It comes from seeing things and experiencing things, and not necessarily having access to lots of information. Some of the most stupidest people I've ever met in my life could be classed as intelligent. They have potentially lots of degrees and diplomas, but don't think very critically and aren't able to argue things from both sides and see things in a balanced and nuanced way. And I think that I'm saying this to say that information doesn't make you wise. We need to look to older generations who've been around, for decades and decades and decades, and have seen things come and go, and can give wise observations and understandings of things that aren't based around remembering facts and information. And I think that, again, to me, this is another poison of the mind, in the sense that by attaining more information and filling your mind with more facts and more information makes you smarter. In my view, it doesn't. To me, these are not correlated. Wisdom comes from experience and intuition. Intuition I talk about a lot on this podcast, because I think that it's something that's not being practiced so much, especially by the younger generation. If you're spending so much time in the fantasy world of the internet and cramming your brain full of facts and information, it doesn't really leave much time to cultivate peace, calm, and wisdom. And that comes from intuition. Yogic practices cultivate intuition. Having a clear mind, not having a million and one things to do, not doing so much, allowing the body and mind to be at peace, allows you to cultivate your intuition. A quiet meditative room daily, for me, is a must for everyone. I know it's not seen that way anymore, but I believe it's a must for everyone to have a space to be able to quiet the mind, go inward. So Pratyahara, so withdraw the senses, withdraw the mind and the body need to be stimulated so much, to remove that, to go into this inner space that we have, and to listen to what comes up from that inner space, to me, cultivates wisdom. That cultivates intuition. And to me, that's been a better guide in my life than any sort of factual information I can read and cram into my head online or the internet. These are completely different things, which is why, again, not to be crude on this podcast, but again, some of the most stupidest people I've met can tell you all sorts of factual statements and information, but aren't very wise and aren't very balanced and necessarily aren't grounded in reality in that way. And I think that this to me is one of the most important aspects of yoga practice, is seeing that more is not necessarily better, that cramming our children's brains with information and facts and being constantly stimulated doesn't really leave any space to withdraw the senses. It doesn't really leave much space to cultivate intuition. These come from empty space. I did a whole episode on sunyata and empty space. This is the playground for this. Having empty space, being able to withdraw the senses, focus our concentration on one thing without being distracted, without having a million other one things to do, is what allows us to go into that empty space. What comes from the empty space is lots of wisdom, lots of deep deep wisdom that we can connect with and track and make a connection with, that doesn't come from being distracted. Being distracted benefits large companies and corporations, yeah? Being distracted means that probably you're listening to someone who's trying to sell you something. Just as a caveat, I'm not trying to sell anything on this podcast, yeah? I'm doing this because I like to share things that I'm passionate about and I care, yeah? But there's lots of things that we can focus our mind on, and these days it's largely people trying to sell you something, yeah? So we have to be wise with what we're listening to, the information we're taking on board, and how much information. Yeah? It's like information overload, yeah? This to me is not a flex. It's not a flex to be exhausted from being so busy physically and mentally. A flex is not collapsing at the end of the day because you've done 1,001 things and your brain is fried from overstimulation. This is not a flex, yeah? You know, what was promoted in Zen is to do one task, yeah? Doing a task, one task creatively, yeah? Even a chore, yeah? You can find joy in a simple task, and most of us will know that when you do those kinds of things, you actually feel really good, yeah? I think some of the most popular videos on YouTube are, you know, restoration projects, or people like ASMR, someone just building something, yeah? People love to just tune into a simple task. The brain quietens down, yeah? It works best that way, yeah? When we're not doing 1,001 things and we're able to just focus on one task. The Ashtanga yoga system is fantastic at cultivating that. I believe a Mysore room and the Ashtanga yoga system is an excellent tool for cultivating Dharana and Pratyahara, yeah, which is why I still practice it and why I teach it, which is why I don't teach other styles of yoga with music and lots of other things going on, because I believe yoga is a method for creating the ability to concentrate and focus, yeah? Being able to focus on one thing, visualize that thing, use your imagination. I talked about imagination a lot on this podcast before, and how potentially children are losing that ability to use their imagination so much. My childhood was mostly filled with that. I wasn't so stimulated. You had to kind of, you know, I remember saying to my mum once I was bored, and my mum said, I'm bored, you know, like as in, you better go and find something to do, lad, you know. So you use your imagination and you live in your own world in some ways as a child, yeah. You I think of my child as a lot of imagination play, lots of creative thoughts, lots of using your imagination to visualize things, yeah. This has a huge benefit to our lives, being able to focus and concentrate on something and use your imagination to visualize something, yeah. I was talking to a student this week who's learning Kapitasana, and we talked a lot about the visualizations that go into backbending and how your mind makes these mental images and connections to muscles that it enables you to do things. Yeah, when you can visualize something and imagine yourself doing it, you are in a way playing out some form of imagined reality. And this has been studied extensively around how our observation and our imaginatory thoughts, how much this interacts with our physical world of creating our reality. This is real, yeah. This is our physical world, comes from our ability to focus our attention on something to create something in the real world. This comes from our imagination. I was talking to another student recently who is a boxing coach, and we talked about, you know, how some of these fighters struggle with concentration, and, you know, they're slightly younger and maybe struggle with just being able to focus on one thing, and that affects their ability to perform. You know, when you go into a fighting event, you need to be locked in and focused on that one thing. You can't be thinking about other things and letting the mind get involved with worries and anxieties, which is something that fighters struggle with a lot. the constant worry and fear that you're not going to do well. And again, this is monkey mind, yeah? You could think about this for a job interview or any sort of stressful situation where the monkey mind just goes on overdrive and you have an inability to control it. You have an inability to, control the mind. This is what yoga practice does, yeah? It enables you to build confidence and control your mind, control your thoughts, yeah? When I was competing in sports, the weeks up until the event, I would just be in this huge visualization mode. When I would go running or I would do any kind of other activity, most of the time I was imagining how those events were going to play out. I was picturing what techniques I would use, and I would imagine those fights before they were played out. Yeah, this was a huge benefit to my competing years. I would say I was very good at that, actually, being able to visualize and imagine what was going to happen. And that tended to happen. Yeah, that tended to go out how I imagined that to go out. It was like a kind of a precursor, a stage I set in my mind to play out what I wanted to happen. Yeah, this was almost like I was using my intention and my willpower to project what I wanted to happen in the future, and I was using my imagination to do that. And again, I think that some techniques, some practices help you cultivate that. So when I see the younger generation who struggle with these kinds of things, they really struggle with the ability to concentrate and lock in. They need these practices, yeah? You need these practices to control your mind, and this will help you in all aspects of your life, really, especially your professional careers and things you want to get better at. Being able to, focus without distraction is not a superpower, but it's a big skill set to have. Meditation, pranayama, yoga, these are great tools for people to be able to do better in their lives without, the monkey mind, without being so distracted. And again, this is not a flex. Yeah, multitasking is good, but an overactive mind that is out of control is not good. It doesn't lead to good things. And I do believe this leads to physical sickness. Yeah, this is something that I observe as a teacher through different things over the years. But mental anxiety, worry, stress really is an inability to control our outer world. But really, it's an over worry about what we're unable to control most of the time. Most stress you could class as an overreaction to things that are out of our control. This goes back to acceptance and other practices that we practice in our yoga practice so that we feel more calm. I literally thought of this today in my own yoga practice, which is not going how I want, and there's an acceptance to that. There's a letting go of what I want. There's a letting go of how I want things to be, and an acceptance of reality. Again, this is what you practice. If something's not going your way, and you create a story to make yourself feel better about why it didn't go your way, you're kind of poisoning your mind. Again, this is like, what are you feeding your mind? An acceptance of that, of finding peace and resolution with something that's out of your control, to me, is you're feeding yourself good things. You're feeding yourself truth. This goes back to how we might practice the Ashtanga yoga system. Something doesn't go our way, it doesn't go the way we want, and then we create a story and a fantasy to make ourselves feel better. This is delusional. This goes against every aspect of yogic practices. And again, you could play that out in other aspects of your life around reinforcing the ego. I did an episode specifically about this on the ego. When something's not going your way and you don't want to feel uncomfortable and meet reality, if you create a story and a fantasy to make yourself feel better temporarily, I believe this is almost like feeding yourself junk food. You're feeding yourself junk. Delusion lies fantasy to make yourself feel better is like eating junk food to me. It's not healthy, and I believe this is what creates an unhealthy mind. This is what leads to disease. This is what leads to physical sickness, I believe. Yeah, these are not separate. I've also talked about this many times on the podcast. When you have a daily yoga practice, you really realize that the mind and the body are completely not separate. Your emotional state, how you feel, these are linked, yeah? To me, these are completely linked. And again, looking at the statistics through the years, people aren't getting healthier in those ways. People are struggling way more than they ever have with mental health, yeah? You have to feed yourself good things. Junk food is lies, delusion, fantasy to reinforce the ego to avoid pain and discomfort. Green vegetables, fruit, good lean food is the truth, yeah, and reality, yeah. That you're feeding yourself, that is going to make you feel good. Animals, pretty much every other animal on this planet, is in that state constantly. They are in reality all the time. They're not in fantasy world. They are met with reality, the harsh consequences of reality every day. I believe this to be healthy. I believe to be healthy is to be in reality and meet in the reality of what things actually are. To be truthful, yeah? To me, this is feeding yourself good food. This is drinking coconut water and papayas and all the things that I love that I miss from living in Indonesia, all the beautiful tropical fruits and things that I used to love eating every day. To me, this is what you want to feed your mind. So when I think about health, mental health, I think about what I'm feeding my mind. I'm thinking about, and you can feel it, yeah? When you're met with the truth and the reality of something, you can feel it in your body. Yeah? It's lighter. I've talked about this before. The truth and reality, things being real, they feel good. You know, to get to the truth of something, to get to the bottom of something, to understand something more clearly, to have more focus on something that you can see clearly, feels good. It feels lighter. It's not heavy, it's not dark. It's not, it feels different, yeah? This is bandha. So for me, dharana, concentration, there's so many examples of why it's good to practice that. Being able to focus on something without being distracted. Yeah? This is withdrawing the senses. Yeah? Turning your attention away from external distractions and turning it inward is where wisdom is. The root of all that wisdom, I would call that God. Yeah? Intuition is some kind of connection to the divine. Yeah? The things that come up from that space are life-changing. I might finish with this. I had another conversation with a student this morning, actually. We was talking about psychedelics and things like that. And, in Norway and sure other countries, ketamine and MDMA, mushrooms and things like that are being used medicinally now as a way for people to connect with some form of intuition, some intuitive state, I believe, that it's healing, yeah? People get more awareness to things that weren't there before. They bridge connections to things that they weren't aware of. And, lots of emotional states are healed and there's lots of benefits from doing those. My argument to that is for lots of people that's scary. For a lot of people it's too scary to go there with psychedelics because they're afraid of letting go and the unknown and what might come up. To me, yoga and a Mysore room, for example, is a trickle version of that. It's a slow drop feed version of that where insights, intuition, things get cleared from the past, memories you didn't really understand come up. And in your meditative practices where you're able to concentrate, dharana, where you're able to withdraw your senses with pratyahara, you're able to focus on these things and things get cleared. Yeah, old emotions get cleared, heartfelt things get connected with, love becomes more connected into our lives and we start to heal. Yeah, yoga's healing in that way. Psychedelics can be, but it's more of a powerful, profound, concentrated method, and I think that it has its value. But I think for most people, steady as she goes is better. It's less scary, and it happens slowly over time. And I think for most people, that's safer. But again, this wouldn't happen without the ability to concentrate and to withdraw the senses, which is why yoga rooms should have that focus. A yoga room that's just distracting you, to me, is something else. I've talked about that on other episodes of, modern yoga, and largely being, distraction. Sense withdrawal, concentration comes from a meditative space. Yeah, the ability to go inward doesn't come from being distracted with stimuli. I think I might have said enough on this today. Let me just check my list. I could go a little bit more into sunyata, but I think I've said enough on that previously. But I think I might just finish with this. This goes back a little bit to the monkey mind, but if I might finish on this about people being so busy, but sometimes the things that are best for us, for our health, aren't necessarily the things that you might want. Yeah. The same with people who have an unhealthy attachment to food or drink and things like that. What they want is more of the things that they want. They want more of the things that cause the excessive weight or cause the addiction to substance, or again, this addiction to information and stimuli in the mind, when what we really need is less. Yeah, what we actually need is to be thinking less and doing less and allowing this space to cultivate intuition. I remember a story from Buddhism where, I might have shared this before, but I'll say it again, where someone goes to a teacher and says, I'm struggling sleeping. And the teacher asks them, well, try counting sheep, because this is like a common method. And they tried counting sheep, but in their bed they would count sheep, and then they would count to the point where they'd start just coming up with different ideas and different creative ideas, and using the sheep and the counting sheep as another method to cultivate some sort of new business idea. But ultimately the counting didn't really quieten their mind, it just stimulated it more. So it just gave them more ideas, and they were unable to sleep because they're so in this thinking state, they're so caught up in this process state of planning that the counting of the sheep just encouraged this sort of way of thinking. So they go back to the teacher and said, this didn't work, what can I do? And after many attempts, the teacher said, well, I think you need to go and take some medication and take some sleeping tablets, and maybe the sleeping tablets will get you off to sleep. So the guy goes away, goes to the chemist, he gets the sleeping tablets, these work, he gets very used to those sleeping tablets, and he starts taking more, to the point where he starts to make himself quite sick and not well, and eventually he stops taking the sleeping tablets because he becomes addicted to those, and it's having a negative effect on his business life and his work. And he goes back to the teacher and says, what now? I've tried this, I've tried that. He says, what kind of teacher are you if you're just supplying me with drugs and medication? And the teacher said, well, the thing you really need to do, you won't. Yeah, the guy had a very important job, big job, lots of responsibility, lots of things going on, and he was addicted to that. He didn't want to give that up. And the teacher says, you're not willing to make the change that you need to change so that you sleep better. So what do you want? Yeah, do you want to just be given something to medicate you so that you can carry on doing what you're doing and kind of getting sicker and sicker? Or do you want to make some real change in your life so that you're more healthy, more balanced, and you're able to sleep? And I think that for a lot of us, it's literally about doing less. Yeah, less thinking and doing less. Yeah, but that means making changes in our lives, making real changes to our lives, so that we're not chasing all the time, that we're able to concentrate better, where we're able to withdraw our senses better, so that we're able to focus on the things that make us feel healthy. And this isn't from information overload. This comes from withdrawing the senses and concentrating our mind on simpler things. This is maybe not as fun and exciting, but it's healthier. You could say that eating clean is not maybe the most fun and exciting for a lot of people, but it's good for you. Personally, I love what I eat. I love the food I eat. I look forward to every meal. I don't eat any processed or junk food. I love the food I eat. It makes me feel great. When I eat something that makes me feel bad after, I tend to not want that again. That's my body's trained that way, really. The things that make me feel worse after, I don't want anymore. So I tend to eat things and do things that make myself feel better. Overstimulation from information makes me feel worse. So I don't do that. It's this, what are we putting into our body? What are we taking in? How are we processing those things, and how does it make us feel? And if it's making us feel more depressed, anxious, cut off, potentially suicidal, then I think that big changes have to be made, so that we're not overloading our systems. I was going to go on another tangent with this, but I might save it for another episode, because I think that this is enough for one podcast. But your yoga practice should be cultivating those two things in unison, where we're not overstimulating ourselves and creating more things to overthink and to worry about, which is again another reason why I teach the Ashtanga system, because when it's embodied and learnt, the mind switches off. It's a movement meditation. It's like practiced intermediate today, just going through the system. Insights come up, things that I was like not aware of come up mid practice. It's just daily. I feel like that happens really. If you go without if you go without practicing yoga for a few days and you're a daily practitioner, you really feel it. And then you get on your mat again, and like realizations come up, truth comes up, intuition comes up. All of the things that were kind of in the background but messy become very clear. This analogy of like a muddy, lake where you can't see the bottom. All of a sudden, all of that just sinks to the bottom, and then the lake becomes crystal clear. I think the yoga practice is cleansing in that way. It's like a filtration of the mind so that you can see things more clearly. And this comes from the ability to concentrate in a quiet space. Ciao.